A simile is a piece of figurative imagery that describes something by comparing it to something else. So in the first example, it says the night was as black as coal. It's describing the night by comparing it to the blackness of coal. Okay. In the second one, the paper is as light as a feather. It's describing the lightness of a feather. Sorry, it's describing the lightness of paper as though it is as light as a feather. All right. So a simile will use like or as to link the comparison. So as I've said, we're focusing on setting and the description of setting, and we're using, we want to sort of look at the way we can use similes to describe setting. So I've put here the idea of trying to create the setting uh, by developing a sense of threat using similes, all right? So if you go back to your blurb, which part of the reason for doing that blurb was to give you some initial ideas about what your dystopian story might be like. So refer to your blurb, which I've done in this example here. So from your blurb, think about the setting that you mentioned in your blurb and create a list of nouns that are connected to the landscape that you mentioned in your blurb. So I've got here the stars. If you remember, my landscape was a kind of a sort of prehistoric landscape. So I've got the stars, the sky, moon, cave, shadow, hills, mountains, river, stones, huts, and ravine. Now, if you didn't write a blurb, don't worry about it. Just try and imagine a dystopian setting. It'll be usually some kind of extreme environment. It could be from the past or in the future. Quite often, dystopias are set in sort of post kind of nuclear war kind of wastelands where the cities are uninhabited and they're sort of perhaps overgrown and things like that. So take a sort of extreme sort of setting and use that as your basis if you didn't produce one in your blurb. And the second stage, step 2, is to produce a list of violent verbs. So don't worry too much about thinking about setting here. Just try and come up with some violent verbs. So off the top of my head, I've produced tore, gouged, slashed, cut, ripped, burned, and scalded. The third stage, or step 3, of your we're constructing similes here, and I'm going through it in step-by-step process. You don't have to do it like this. I mean, some of you might find it easy just to come up with similes to describe a setting very easily, but this you can use this process to support that. If you you find it hard to come up with similes just off the top of your head like that. So here's a third stage. So in stage 1 we had a list of nouns, stage 2 some violent verbs, and stage 3 we're now looking for a list of negative objects. Do you remember we were talking about us describing the setting with a sense of threat? So threat, we're thinking negative objects, again connected to the world of your blurb story. So here I have night, lava, fire, pitch, bleached bone, torn flesh, eye socket, blood, thunder, and skull. Okay. Again, I haven't put anything here to do with machines because there are no machines in my dystopian story. So I focused on things that are negative that would go with the setting that I've introduced in my blurb. So once you have these 3 lists, a list of nouns, a list of violent verbs, and a list of negative objects connected to your dystopian setting, we're then going to use those items from those 3 lists to try and construct some similes. So if we look at the examples that I've produced here, the first one, the cave glared down from the hillside like a deep eye socket from a green skull. Now cave was from my list of nouns in step 1, and skull was from my list of negative objects in step 3. I didn't have any particularly violent verbs that I felt would go with this one, so I've just used my own, and I came up with looked first of all, but then I changed that because I thought glared was stronger. So the cave glared down from the hillside like a deep eye socket from a green skull. I felt that created a sense of threat with my description. There's something intimidating and a bit unnerving about this cave in the hillside. Okay. All right, and then the second one, the river gouged out the landscape like sharp teeth tearing into soft flesh. I've used a couple of things from the lists there. One of the nouns was river, and soft flesh was from my list of negative objects. And then I've used two of the violent verbs from my list of verbs. I've used gouged and tear. Change the tense on tear to tearing. You don't have to use the exact same word that you came up with. If it's a verb, you can change the tense to present or past. It just move that around, modify that verb tense to suit your simile. The river gouged out the landscape like sharp teeth tearing into soft flesh. So again, sense of threat. This is a sort of quite a dangerous sort of landscape, really, a place where there's risk and risk for people who are in it, which I felt created a sense of threat. And then the third one, the moon ripped a hole in the sky like white lava through velvet. The moon was one of my objects. Ripped was a violent verb, and lava I felt was a negative object for my landscape. I've put them all together and come up with the simile there. So that's what you've got to do, to try and come up with three similes for your landscape, creating a sense of threat. Have a go at combining items from your lists in the way that I've done here, but that doesn't mean you can't just invent some similes off the top of your head. If you can think of things that work, things will just pop into people's heads sometimes. You don't always have to go through a three-stage process like this, but use the three-stage process if you can't come up with three different similes to describe your landscape and make that landscape sound threatening and dangerous. We're now going to look at metaphor as another method of enhancing our description of setting in dystopia. A metaphor works very much like a simile, except that where a simile describes something by comparing it to something else, a metaphor describes something by turning it into something else. So we're going to read this poem called Metaphors by Sylvia Plath. Just illustrate the metaphors that are used in it. I'll make a couple of points about that, and then we'll move on to our own metaphor activity. Here we go. I'm a riddle in 9 syllables, an elephant, a ponderous house, a melon strolling on 2 tendrils. Oh, red fruit, ivory, fine timbers, this loaf's big with its yeasty rising. Money's new minted in this fat purse. I'm a means, a stage, a cowing calf. I've eaten a bag of green apples, boarded the train. There's no getting off. Now, this poem uses a number of, in fact, it's nearly every line contains a metaphor, at least one metaphor, describing the experience of being heavily pregnant. So I think they're all very effective, very strong. It's a very famous poem. I particularly like a melon strolling on 2 tendrils, to describe her physical condition when she's heavily pregnant. Her torso is so huge because of the size of the baby in the womb that it makes her torso feel round like a large melon, and her legs, in contrast, appear so thin because of the fact that her torso is so large because of her extended womb. And so therefore a melon strolling on 2 tendrils is quite a comic image, where she's clearly sort of laughing at her own sort of predicament of being heavily pregnant, okay, and making fun of the way she appears. So it's if you look through, you'll see a number of there are numerous metaphors to describe the physical condition and experience of being pregnant. And the central method, isn't it, is to convert one thing into another, to convert one noun into another. So instead of saying I have a large. People often say belly, don't they? But belly is obviously technically incorrect. I'm heavily swollen, or I'm heavily pregnant, and my baby's quite large in the womb. But instead of saying that, she said she's a melon strolling on two tendrils. So she transformed the description of her extended womb into a melon. Okay, so one noun is transformed into another. What else have we got here? Let's have a look. Money's new minted in this fat purse. Again, describing something, a purse contains something of value. Money is valuable, and it's a fat purse that suggests there's a lot of money in it, and it's newly minted. So again, describing the baby inside the womb as money is new minted money, something that's valuable, and there's a lot of it inside the fat purse, which is her womb. Okay, so there are lots of other metaphors that you can have a look at and think through yourself. But again, it's describing a baby in the womb as though it's money new minted, and the womb is described as a fat purse. So a noun, baby, is converted into another noun, new minted money, and the noun womb is converted into another noun, a fat purse. Okay? Here's perhaps a simpler example of the way that a metaphor works. As I've said a couple of times, a metaphor merely substitutes one noun for another. So if it was extremely hot, on an intensely hot summer's day, you could say, you describe that intense heat in the garden by saying the garden was a furnace. Okay, so the noun garden has simply been substituted for the noun furnace. That's a simple metaphor, but that's how you do it. Okay. One way of practicing and getting to see the way that a metaphor is simply the substitution or the conversion of one noun into another is by using some random nouns and seeing if you can make some metaphors out of them. So I put a link on here. I'll put the link on the Google Classroom so you can access it to a random lists of nouns website. I've just copied a page here. You can just simply refresh the page every time you want to change all the nouns on the page, and it will produce another sort of 10 or so nouns for you to work with. So try and work with them whatever page comes up. Don't keep going through the pages till you come up with something that you like. Just stick with whatever page you come up with, and it will be a good challenge for you to try and make some metaphors out of it. So here on the random nouns page, I had shelf, air, direction, seed, curved, silver, feeling, drain, sponge, hope, join, and coat. Now, they don't have to, at this point, you don't have to create metaphors that describe your setting at the minute. We're just having a go at looking at the way that metaphors work, really. So you've got 10 nouns, and then what we're going to do is try and turn those into metaphors. So from the list of nouns, I've created some metaphors. So we had air and we had silver, we had coat and sponge, we had hope and drain, curved, jar and shelf. So I think some seed. So what I've done is try to see if I can match up some of those nouns from that list of 10 to see if I can make some metaphors. So I've got coat and sponge. It's a bit random, but we've got to go with what we have on the screen. So I suppose if it was very, very wet and it'd been raining heavily, that would work quite well, wouldn't it? And it might become very heavy, like a sponge becomes heavy when it's drenched with water. So the coat was a sponge. Hope is a drain. I quite like that. It sort of worked out quite well. Again, they're just a random combination of nouns, but the idea that, again, this seems to describe hope as being something that is perhaps leads to nowhere particularly positive. It's a bit of a cynical metaphor there, but I was just, again, working with the nouns that I had from that random noun generator. The air felt silver. I quite like that one. That might actually work for my dystopian setting. I might keep that. And there are others there too. And hopefully you can see the process. It's simply just seeing if you match up the nouns on your page to try and create some metaphors. Be a bit, play around with them, be a bit random with them, mix them about and see what happens. You'll be surprised what might come from that. If there are any that you think will work in your description of a dystopian setting, then save them, keep them, note them. But this activity is just designed for you to see how you can construct metaphors. Metaphors often seem very difficult things to put together, but really it's simply substituting one noun for another. Okay. Let's just recap the 4 lessons that we've had so far. This is the 4th lesson. We're sort of halfway through it. Lesson 1 looked at the idea. All of these lessons have been looking at dystopia and looking at dystopian settings. And the first thing we got you to do was to write a blurb. And the reason for doing that was to try and think about the idea of setting, to make you put the setting in your blurb. And on an earlier video, it was mentioned that a setting can be a bit like a kind of character in a story, in the sense an antagonistic character, an antagonist, something that provides difficulty and problems for your main protagonist, your main character. So setting is very important, and that's what we're working on in a minute. So the first lesson looks at introducing the idea of setting, and you wrote a blurb. And then the second lesson, you were asked to use an extended metaphor to describe school as though it's a prison, on the basis that dystopian settings, the dystopian worlds, are quite like prisons in some way, and that was a good way of thinking about it. And then you were also asked to do some try that out for some other use extended metaphor in different other situations. And then thirdly, we looked at personification in an extended way, again on the basis that because a setting can be a bit like an antagonistic character, providing problems and conflict for your main character, that if you can personify that, use personification, that will work really well. And then this lesson we've been looking at simile and metaphor, and then we've got to this point now. Okay, so what you're going to do is a sort of a kind of I suppose a task to enable you to sort of tie together everything we've done so far. And you're going to write 200 words. 200 words isn't very much. It sounds a lot, but once you get going, it isn't very much at all. If anybody wants to write more than that, please do. It's up to you. If you get going with it, that's fine. But 200 words, aim for that. That's at least something quite significant and substantial. 200 words. A 200-word description of dystopian setting, as though this was the first page of a longer story about a dystopia. You can include anything you've written so far, any similes or metaphors that you wrote that you liked, or if any of your extended metaphor activity worked quite well, maybe you could blend that into this piece of writing here. So go back and look at anything you've done so far and work out what it is you think you can use, and note that down. And then I'd like you to write a 200-word description of a dystopian setting, and just again, you must aim to include personification, metaphor, and simile, because that's what we've been working on in these lessons, and preferably use those 2 or 3 times if you can. Okay, and then submit that work to your teacher, and we will look forward to reading that. Thank you.